Belief as a moral act in the late 19th century, a period marked by scientific optimism, religious doubt, and rapid social change. A quiet but radical philosophical claim was put forward, one that challenged how ordinary people thought about belief itself. In 1877, the mathematician and philosopher William Kingdon Clifford published an essay titled The Ethics of Belief. Though modest in length, the essay carried a forceful moral message. Believing is not an innocent or purely private activity. Instead, belief is an ethical act, one for which individuals can be held morally responsible. Clifford's most famous line, stark and uncompromising, captures this idea with remarkable clarity. It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. At first glance, this claim appears severe, even authoritarian. After all, beliefs seem to belong to the inner world of the mind, personal, subjective, and free. How could something as private as belief be subject to moral judgment? Clifford's answer is both subtle and unsettling. Beliefs, he argues, are never merely internal. They shape actions, influence decisions, and ultimately affect other people. To believe carelessly, therefore, is not simply an intellectual error. It is a moral failure. Clifford's philosophy begins with a fundamental rethinking of what belief is and what it does. Belief is not a passive mental state, like a fleeting emotion or a passing thought. It is an orientation toward the world, a commitment to seeing reality in a particular way. Once a belief is formed, it silently guides behavior. It determines how one votes, whom one trusts, what risks one takes, and what harms one may unknowingly permit. From this perspective, belief becomes inseparable from responsibility. To make this abstract point vivid, Clifford opens his essay with a powerful moral parable, one that has since become one of the most discussed examples in epistemology. He asks the reader to imagine a ship owner who plans to send an old vessel to sea. The ship is worn, poorly maintained, and possibly unsafe. The owner is aware of these concerns. Doubts arise in his mind, doubts that call for inspection, repair, or at the very least, serious investigation. Yet instead of acting on these doubts, the owner suppresses them. He reassures himself that the ship has made many voyages before, that Providence will protect the passengers, and that costly repairs are unnecessary. The ship sets sail. It sinks mid-voyage. All on board perish. Clifford's moral judgment is striking. He insists that the ship owner is guilty, even if the ship had arrived safely. The wrongdoing does not depend on the outcome. It lies in the act of believing without sufficient evidence. The owner chose comfort over inquiry, reassurance over responsibility. In doing so, he committed a moral wrong before the ship ever left the harbor. This example reveals the core of Clifford's argument. Belief itself is ethically charged. The ship owner's failure was not merely practical negligence, but intellectual dishonesty. He allowed himself to believe what he wished to be true, rather than what the evidence justified. That choice, Clifford argues, is morally blameworthy. From here, Clifford expands the scope of his claim. The ship owner is not a special case. Every individual in everyday life constantly forms beliefs under conditions of uncertainty. Some of these beliefs appear trivial: rumors, assumptions, casual opinions. Others are profound: religious convictions, political ideologies, moral principles. Yet all beliefs, no matter how small they seem, contribute to what Clifford calls the intellectual atmosphere of society. Each belief either strengthens or weakens the collective commitment to truth, evidence, and reason. This is why Clifford rejects the idea that belief is a purely private matter. Even when a belief does not immediately lead to action, it shapes the believer's habits of thought. A person who allows themselves to believe without evidence trains their mind in credulity. Over time, this habit dulls skepticism and weakens critical judgment. Such a person becomes more susceptible to deception, superstition, and manipulation. When many individuals adopt this attitude, society as a whole suffers. Clifford's philosophy is deeply moral, but also deeply social. He sees human beings not as isolated thinkers, but as members of an intellectual community. Knowledge is shared, transmitted, and inherited. Beliefs spread from person to person, from generation to generation. A single unexamined belief can multiply, shaping traditions, institutions, and norms long after its origin is forgotten. For this reason, Clifford insists that believing responsibly is not merely a personal virtue. It is a social duty, yet at the heart of this duty lies what Clifford calls the duty of inquiry. To inquire is not simply to collect facts, but to approach belief formation with honesty, humility, and effort. It requires acknowledging uncertainty, seeking evidence, and remaining open to revision. Clifford does not demand omniscience. He recognizes that human knowledge is limited and that certainty is often unattainable. What he demands instead is sincerity, a genuine attempt to proportion belief to evidence. Importantly, Clifford rejects the excuse of convenience. One cannot justify a belief simply because investigation is difficult, time-consuming, or uncomfortable. Intellectual laziness, in his view, is not morally neutral. To refuse inquiry when evidence is available is to abdicate one's responsibility as a rational being. Even worse is willful ignorance, the deliberate avoidance of evidence because it threatens a comforting belief. This, for Clifford, represents a profound ethical failure. Clifford's uncompromising stance often provokes resistance. Many readers feel that his standard is too strict, too demanding for ordinary life. Must we really examine the evidence for every belief we hold? Clifford's answer is nuanced. While not every belief requires exhaustive investigation, every belief that influences action or affects others demands scrutiny. Moreover, habits formed in small matters inevitably spill into larger ones. A mind trained to accept claims without evidence in trivial contexts will struggle to demand rigor when it truly matters. By the end of the first part of his argument, Clifford has fundamentally transformed the concept of belief. Belief is no longer a harmless mental state or a matter of personal preference. It is a moral act with consequences that ripple outward into society. To believe responsibly is to respect truth, protect others, and honor one's role in the shared human pursuit of knowledge. To believe irresponsibly is to contribute, however subtly, to a culture of falsehood and harm. This vision sets the stage for the deeper arguments that follow. If belief shapes action, and if beliefs are socially contagious, then the ethical stakes of belief formation are far higher than commonly assumed. In the next chapter, these ideas will be developed further as Clifford explores the inseparable relationship between belief and action, and the dangers that arise when societies tolerate belief without evidence. Belief, action, and the social consequences of credulity. If Chapter 1 established that belief is a moral act, Chapter 2 deepens the argument by showing why belief cannot be separated from action, and how careless belief quietly reshapes society itself. Clifford's concern is not limited to dramatic cases like the sinking ship. His real target is something far more common and far more dangerous. The everyday habit of believing without sufficient evidence. At the center of Clifford's reasoning lies a simple but powerful claim. No belief is inert. Even when a belief appears to remain confined to the mind, it subtly alters how a person perceives the world, evaluates risks, and responds to others. Belief forms the background against which action becomes possible. In this sense, belief is not merely prior to action, it is already a form of action, a mental commitment that directs future behavior. Clifford argues that people often underestimate this connection. They imagine belief as harmless, so long as it does not immediately result in visible harm. But this assumption, he insists, rests on a misunderstanding of human psychology. Beliefs shape dispositions. They influence what feels reasonable, acceptable, or normal. Over time, these internal shifts manifest externally, sometimes in ways the believer never anticipated. Consider a person who accepts a claim without evidence because it aligns with their comfort or identity. At first, the belief may seem trivial, an opinion, a hunch, a rumor repeated without verification. Yet that belief subtly trains the mind to value emotional satisfaction over truth. Once this habit is established, it becomes easier to accept stronger claims on similarly weak grounds. The transition is gradual and often unnoticed, but its effects are cumulative. This is why Clifford insists that belief and action are inseparable. Even when a belief does not directly motivate a single identifiable act, it contributes to a pattern of thinking that shapes countless future decisions. A society composed of individuals who tolerate weak evidence will inevitably produce institutions, policies, and norms built on unstable foundations. Clifford's argument becomes especially forceful when he turns from individual psychology to collective life. Beliefs do not exist in isolation. They are communicated through language, education, tradition, and media. Once expressed, a belief enters the shared intellectual environment, influencing others who may adopt it without question. In this way, belief becomes contagious. This social dimension of belief dramatically raises the moral stakes. A single unjustified belief can multiply across a population, reinforcing prejudice, superstition, or false certainty. Clifford warns that when societies tolerate belief without evidence, they erode their collective respect for reason itself. Truth becomes secondary to convenience, loyalty, or emotional comfort. Over time, the distinction between justified belief and mere opinion begins to collapse. Clifford is particularly concerned with the long-term effects of this erosion. When people grow accustomed to believing without inquiry, they become vulnerable to manipulation. Demagogues, ideologues, and opportunists thrive in such environments. Claims need not be true. They need only be appealing. In this sense, credulity is not merely a personal weakness, it is a social liability. For Clifford, this is not a speculative fear, but a moral certainty grounded in human history. He sees superstition, fanaticism, and mass delusion as the predictable outcomes of intellectual negligence. When skepticism is discouraged and inquiry is seen as impolite or threatening, falsehood gains a foothold. Once established, it becomes self-reinforcing, defended not by evidence, but by tradition and social pressure. At this point in the argument, Clifford introduces one of his most demanding ethical claims. Every person has a duty to protect the integrity of the shared pool of knowledge. Just as citizens have obligations not to pollute physical environments, they also have obligations not to contaminate the intellectual environment with unjustified beliefs. To pass on a belief without checking its grounds is, in Clifford's view, a form of moral negligence. This claim challenges a deeply ingrained assumption that sincerity is enough. Many people believe that holding a belief honestly, without malicious intent, absolves them of responsibility. Clifford firmly rejects this idea. Sincerity, he argues, is morally irrelevant if it is not accompanied by inquiry. One can be sincerely mistaken, sincerely careless, sincerely harmful. What matters is not whether one means well, but whether one has respected the obligation to seek truth. Clifford's critique of credulity becomes sharper when he addresses the defense of harmless beliefs. Some beliefs, critics argue, seem too insignificant to matter. Does it really matter if someone believes a superstition, an unverified story, or an optimistic assumption? Clifford's response is uncompromising. The danger lies not in any single belief, but in the habit of believing without evidence. Habits shape character, and character shapes action. Once credulity becomes habitual, It no longer confines itself to harmless domains. A mind that does not demand evidence in small matters will not suddenly become rigorous in large ones. The intellectual discipline required to evaluate serious claims is built through constant practice. To abandon it selectively is to weaken it entirely. This insistence on intellectual discipline leads Clifford to articulate what he sees as the moral core of rational life, the duty of inquiry. Inquiry is not optional. It is not a luxury reserved for scholars or scientists. It is a basic ethical obligation attached to belief itself. To believe responsibly is to ask, what evidence supports this? What reasons justify it? What reasons might undermine it? Clifford acknowledges that inquiry has limits. Human beings are finite. Time, access to information, and cognitive capacity are all constrained. But these limitations do not excuse intellectual passivity. What matters is not exhaustive investigation, but honest effort. One must inquire as far as reasonably possible, given the significance of the belief and its potential consequences. Failing to do so, Clifford argues, represents a form of moral abdication. It is a refusal to take responsibility for one's role as a rational agent within a shared moral world. Such refusal, when widespread, creates societies in which falsehood spreads faster than truth and confidence replaces understanding. As Clifford's argument unfolds, a clear ethical vision emerges. Belief is not merely about what one thinks. It is about how one lives with others. To believe responsibly is to participate in a collective commitment to truth, reason, and mutual protection from harm. To believe irresponsibly is to weaken that commitment and endanger the moral fabric of society. By the end of Chapter 2, Clifford has pushed his thesis far beyond individual error. He has shown that unjustified belief is not just a private mistake, but a public wrong. It degrades intellectual standards, normalizes ignorance, and creates conditions in which harm becomes more likely and more widespread. The ethics of belief, therefore, is not a narrow philosophical concern. It is a foundation for ethical social life. This prepares the ground for the final stage of the discussion. If the duty of inquiry is so demanding, critics may reasonably ask whether it is too demanding. Are there cases where belief without sufficient evidence is not only permissible but necessary? These challenges and Clifford's responses to them will form the focus of the final chapter. Objections, legacy, and the enduring ethics of belief. By the time Clifford reaches the later stages of the ethics of belief, the force of his argument is unmistakable. Belief has been transformed from a private mental affair into a morally charged activity with social consequences. Yet Clifford is fully aware that such a demanding standard will provoke resistance. Chapter 3 is therefore not merely a continuation of his thesis, but a defense of it and engagement with the most serious objections and a reflection on why his ideas matter far beyond their historical moment. One of the most common objections. Clifford anticipates concerns pragmatic belief. Critics argue that human life often requires belief in the absence of sufficient evidence. Trust in friends, confidence in one's abilities, hope for success, and faith in uncertain outcomes all seem essential to meaningful action. If one were to wait for sufficient evidence in every case, critics claim life would become paralyzed by doubt. Clifford's response is careful but firm. He does not deny that action often precedes certainty. What he rejects is the idea that belief without evidence is therefore justified. In his view, even pragmatic beliefs must be grounded in some form of evidence, however provisional or incomplete. Trust in a friend's loyalty, for example, is not blind faith when it arises from past experience, consistent behavior, and reasonable inference. The problem is not acting under uncertainty. The problem is believing without caring whether one's belief is true. For Clifford, the danger of pragmatic belief lies in its tendency to excuse intellectual negligence. Once people allow usefulness to replace truth as the standard of belief, the door is open to self-deception. A belief may feel empowering, comforting, or motivating, and still be false. To accept such beliefs uncritically is to place emotional satisfaction above intellectual integrity. Clifford insists that this trade-off is ethically unacceptable, no matter how beneficial the belief may seem in the short term. A second objection focuses on the insignificance of certain beliefs. Surely, critics argue, not all beliefs matter enough to warrant rigorous scrutiny. Casual assumptions, minor superstitions, or inconsequential opinions appear harmless. Why burden ordinary life with constant skepticism? Clifford's reply strikes at the heart of his philosophy. The moral danger does not lie in any single trivial belief, but in the habit of credulity that such beliefs cultivate. Belief formation is a practice, and practices shape character. A mind that routinely accepts claims without evidence becomes accustomed to intellectual passivity. Over time, this passivity extends into areas where the stakes are far higher. Politics, ethics, religion, and science dot in this way. Clifford reframes the objection. The issue is not whether a particular belief causes harm, but whether it contributes to a culture that tolerates belief without justification. When such tolerance becomes widespread, society loses its defenses against error, manipulation, and collective delusion. The harm, though indirect, is real and enduring. Perhaps the most serious challenge to Clifford's position concerns the burden of constant inquiry. Critics argue that his standard is unrealistic. Human beings lack the time, resources, and expertise to investigate every belief they hold. If Clifford's rule were applied strictly, ordinary people would be condemned simply for being human. Clifford acknowledges these practical limitations, but he refuses to abandon the moral principle. The duty of inquiry, he argues, is not a demand for perfection, but a demand for sincerity. One must inquire as far as reasonably possible, given the significance of the belief and its potential consequences. What matters is not exhaustive proof, but an honest effort to align belief with evidence. Crucially, Clifford emphasizes proportionality. The greater the potential impact of a belief, the stronger the obligation to investigate it. Beliefs that guide action, shape institutions, or influence others carry a heavier moral weight. To form such beliefs casually is not merely careless, it is ethically irresponsible. Despite Clifford's careful responses, his strict evidentialism has not gone unchallenged. One of the most famous critiques comes from William James, whose essay The Will to Believe argues that there are situations in which belief without sufficient evidence is not only permissible, but necessary. James focuses especially on religious and existential beliefs, claiming that some truths can only be discovered if one is willing to believe. First, James accuses Clifford of ignoring the emotional and practical dimensions of human life. In certain cases, James argues, withholding belief may itself be a moral failure, a refusal to commit, to hope, or to engage fully with life. From this perspective, Clifford's demand for evidence appears cold, overly rational, and detached from human experience. The debate between Clifford and James remains one of the most influential in modern philosophy. Yet even critics of Clifford often concede his central insight. Belief is not morally neutral. Whether one sides with evidentialism or allows for exceptions, the idea that beliefs carry ethical responsibility has become impossible to ignore. Clifford's legacy extends far beyond 19th century philosophy. In the modern world, his warnings feel almost prophetic. We live in an age of information overload, misinformation, and ideological polarization. False beliefs spread rapidly through social media, often detached from evidence and reinforced by emotion, identity, and group loyalty. In such an environment, Clifford's insistence on the duty of inquiry feels less like an abstract ideal and more like a moral necessity. The consequences of credulity today are not hypothetical. Unexamined beliefs influence elections, public health decisions, social divisions, and even violence. When evidence is dismissed and skepticism is mocked, societies become vulnerable to manipulation on a massive scale. Clifford's argument reminds us that these outcomes are not accidents. They are the predictable result of abandoning intellectual responsibility about at the same time. Clifford's philosophy challenges individuals to reflect inwardly. It asks uncomfortable questions. Why do I believe what I believe? Have I examined the evidence, or have I accepted this belief because it is convenient, comforting, or familiar? What responsibilities do I bear for the beliefs I pass on to others? In framing belief as an ethical act, Clifford elevates critical thinking from a technical skill to a moral virtue. Inquiry becomes not merely a method for discovering truth, but a form of respect for reality, for others, and for oneself as a rational being. To believe responsibly is to participate honestly in the shared human project of understanding the world. The enduring power of the ethics of belief lies in this moral vision. Clifford does not offer easy answers or comforting exceptions. Instead, he issues a challenge to resist the lure of credulity, to question even cherished assumptions, and to treat belief with the seriousness it deserves. His message is demanding, but it is also profoundly respectful of human agency. It affirms that individuals are capable of reason, and that with this capacity comes responsibility. In the end, Clifford's essay is not merely about belief, it is about integrity. It reminds us that what we accept as true shapes not only our actions, but the moral character of the societies we inhabit. To believe carelessly is to surrender that character. To believe responsibly is to help preserve it.